Welcome, everybody, to an incredibly special Legends and Lectures episode. I'm here with the nerd in chief. I'm so excited. Uh, the wonderful, the lovely Greg Jenner. We all bow, we all bow, we all clap at the
Mhm.
same time. The host with the most lapsed
Oh,
academic, or maybe not. Uh,
no.
and voice for hire, lover of music, too. You have a lovely guitar. But I actually wanted to read your bio from A Million Years in a Day because I love this one. This is great. It says, Greg Jenner, the historical consultant to CBBC's multi-award-winning Horrible Histories and various spin-offs, as well as contributing sketches and song lyrics and co-writing Stephen Fry's links, Greg has been solely responsible for the actually of nearly 1,200 comedy sketches that span the entirety of human history. He studied at the University of York after dropping plans for a PhD. Well done. Has spent the past decade making historical documentaries and dramas for television. I think that does a pretty bang up job, but great. How would you describe yourself?
Well, um, public historian is what I tend to go with. That's my comfort title. Unfortunately, autocorrect often changes that to pubic historian, which I'm okay with too. So pubic historian, public historian, both fine. Um, yeah, I mean, I wrote that book you very kindly read out. I mean, I wrote that 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So since then, I've become, I guess, a radio podcast person more now. So I don't do so much television. I do more podcasting now. So now I host a show called You're Dead to Me on the BBC, which is a
Yes,
comedy and history show. So how would I describe myself? Tired. It's what I describe myself as, tired and weary.
but certainly busy. I mean, you're on tour now with You're Dead to Me as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been a huge fun. We did the first gig last week in London at the Adelphi Theatre, and it was huge fun. And we've got three more to come next in a couple in about 9 days, 10 days time. So that was a really lovely thing because normally when you do jokes on the radio, you don't know if they're funny until you find out 4 weeks later when it broadcasts, and you get the angry letters and think, "Oh, that wasn't so funny then." Whereas in a room full of people, if you do a joke and they laugh, you think, "Great, that's encouraging."
It goes both ways though, because if you're in a room and people have you go, there you go, ha ha ha, yes, that was great. But if you throw a joke into the wind, as we often do on many of our programs, we don't care if anybody laughs because we're not around to hear the
No.
at the end
Well,
of
we've
it.
got three jokes in the script for the our live tour, which are deliberately bad jokes, where the aim is to try and get a groan, and that is Yeah. a kind of Mark was saying before we started about the joy of a pun. I love a Mhm. pun, Mhm. so there are three jokes in the script, and two of them got a proper groan, and I was delighted. That's, that's
No.
what you want.
As I say,
Yeah.
I'm a historical linguist, so but between
Mm.
Mark, who's the archaeologist, and you, who the historian, the amount of puns that show up in any, I don't know what it is that lends itself to the historical professors, but I sit here and I have learned the art of just going and just wait and watching you groan. And that's my joy is to see you squirm with the anxiety and anguish that you have caused yourselves. That's what I love so
I feel
much.
no shame. I don't know about Mark, but I feel no. I'm I'm very happy to wield a pun with
I,
no
well,
real. Yeah.
I think as I was saying to Michelle last week, uh, the weird thing is that moment when you realize that, in my case at least, you're utterly hooked on the twisted version of dopamine that you get from
Mhm.
people's pain. Yeah, you just like, oh, I need it, I need more of it, and then when it's not given to you, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, you just like,
That's it. It's sort of Schadenfreude, but you're
yeah,
chasing it. You found a
yeah,
route to it, haven't you? Yeah.
yeah,
Yes. No.
yeah,
I love a pun, and my daughter's 6, and I'm very quickly indoctrinating her in the
perfect
skills of
age. Yeah.
punning, and she's starting to learn how to pun. And my wife is absolutely miserable because now there's two of us. So it's
For your daughter, though, you have to teach her to do the ah,
hey,
ah.
hey, hey, hey,
uh,
hey. No,
Uh.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Dad jokes ahoy. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well,
Hmm.
yeah, that's even worse in your case. You have the double whammy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you did history and archaeology, and you did
I
your medieval
did.
studies as well,
Yeah.
at University of York. But you decided not to do your PhD.
I couldn't
Well,
afford it.
yeah,
Yeah.
me neither. And
Yeah.
that's why we're all here because
That's why we're all here. We're
yeah.
broken and wounded and tired. Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't afford my PhD. I borrowed money to do my master's
Mm.
and just sort of ended up in a sort of cycle of debt where I couldn't then go on to do more PhD on top of master's. So I went into
Mm.
telly instead, went into the TV industry and have had this very bizarre career ever since, a sort of circuitous route of about 9 different careers, I think, at one point, and here I am now as sort of a podcaster. But there wasn't even a thing. Podcasting didn't exist when I was at university. So yeah, it's a curious one. But I now I'm a fellow of York University where I study, which is lovely. So I do a bit of teaching there, and at Royal Holloway as well, which is a really lovely thing. So I do get a tiny sliver of academic joy. I just get the nice bits. I just get to show up, listen to smart young people suggesting their ideas. I get to go, oh, that's a smart, yeah, that's good, that's interesting, and then I go home again. It's great.
Yeah. You're not responsible for how they do.
No
Yeah,
paperwork,
exactly.
no admin, no
Yep,
meetings,
yep.
no none of that. Just nodding and going, bye.
So I really don't know if this is preempting something that Michelle's about to ask, but you've just mentioned that you see yourself as a public historian, but
Yeah.
also obviously you've also mentioned that puns and humor are lifeblood. Is that one of the secret weapons or secret sort of bits of the source that you think actually helps get complicated ideas across to the public?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think so. I use humor in my work. That is what I think. That's what makes me perhaps different to most historians in terms of, for me, it's intentional. I pursue humor as my methodology. So jokes and levity and sort of linguistic sort of turns of phrase that feel interesting and novel are something I kind of pursue. So in all my book writing, whether it's for children or for adults, when I'm doing podcasts, to a certain extent, less so on television. On TV, I'm not so funny. I don't know why that is. I think there's something innate in my brain that when I sit in front of a camera, I sort of turn into like serious mode almost. But certainly, yeah, jokes are my thing, and puns. I've always done puns my whole life. As a teenager, I was writing stupid sketches and puns and silly comedy songs, and wordplay has always been my first instinct. I can't help it, I think. So I can turn anything into a pun. I can turn anything into a dirty joke, which is not at all needed on the radio. So I don't do that so much. But I've got that ability, I think, that comes from a childhood of growing up in a house of my mum's French and my dad's English. And so I sort of grew up in a bilingual house, but also I just watched an awful lot of comedy growing up. So oddly enough, I wasn't really watching lots of history growing up. I wasn't really reading lots of history growing up. Comedy was my primary thing. So I'm a historian and I'm passionate about it. But my training, I guess my lifelong training, is in wordplay and that kind of algorithmic magic trick of a punchline that surprises you. You've got the setup, you've got the kind of twist, and the punchline comes out of left field. That's something I learned way earlier than learning what history was or how to do it.
There are scientific studies in that if you are enjoying something, your brain kicks in
Mm,
and you learn about it commits to memory better. And
yeah,
so we do know that if people are laughing, they do remember things much better. So at least there is
I think
that
so.
sort of memory aspect of the learning.
Yeah. I mean, that was hugely important. So sorry to interrupt you, Michelle, but it's hugely important on horrible histories. We
Mhm.
we became acutely aware that when you're dealing with children, for example, and you're hoping that they will retain information and they will learn and they will start to build a kind of understanding of the past in all of its complexity, by creating these kind of neural anchors, these little kind of waypoints that hold them down and sort of pin them to the fact, pin the child's mind to a piece of information. The joke is so much more powerful than anything else, other than I think horror. I think there's quite a lot of work on horror being very good at, fear being a sort of primal instinct to, I guess, drive us away from danger rather than towards it. But jokes are this amazing mechanism to get people to laugh, relax, and go, oh, I'm having fun. But also because jokes have this sort of this structure to them and this lovely payoff, they are innately more memorable than information delivered in a sort of neutral tone. Like I'll often say to people, tell me a joke, and they'll be able to sort of recall a joke like that. And then I'll say, okay, tell me a fact. And I can see them going, and they're sort of struggling to think of something, and then they're trying to phrase it, and they haven't quite got it right, and then they're like, "No, it's not that. It's not the. No, it's the, hang on, what?" And I can see them sort of stumbling around because they're trying to recall the information, but they haven't got the phraseology to articulate it off the cuff. Whereas a joke, we learn it. It's like a song. You learn a joke, you repeat the joke. The effect is instant and immediate if you've told it well. People laugh. and that piece of information is in your brain forever. And it's an amazing thing. And so on Horrible Histories, we deliberately leaned into that. And we started to realize the songs were extremely powerful for that reason, because
Yeah.
songs, if you do funny songs, you've got both a joke and you've got a melody.
Hmm.
And of course, if you shoot a funny music video, and then you've got three things working for you. You've now got a funny visual and a funny melody and funny jokes. So we
Yeah.
started front loading all of our kind of big ideas into these songs that we did. And I ended up working on about 160, I think, in total. 160 songs, nearly 2,000 sketches by the end of my 11 years on the show. And those songs are sort of dense, they're full of jokes, they're full of
Mhm.
references. They've got these kind of lovely visual pastiche elements to them. And I meet people now in their 20s and so on who can quote those songs off the top of their head. They can literally just reel them off word by word. And they're 23, they're 24. They haven't seen the show in however many years, but it's just in their brain. And that's amazing. And, that's the joy of comedy. It's more important. It's that dopamine hit mark, as you mentioned.
Mm.
Music
Is
also
it?
does
Yeah,
things to get in your
yeah,
brain. We know that. I mean, I can remember
yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
11, 12. Yeah.
12. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can remember that, and I don't. It's just there forever. It's deep seated in my brain. Or plop plop fizz fizz. So what a relief it is. And you say that to people in certain, and of course, immediately we can recall that jingle. We know that. So
Yeah.
combining those things together to increase. It's funny though that you say you meet people who can't recall facts, because let me tell you about the YouTube comment section, Greg, and and how many people immediately will tell you erroneous facts that they've learned.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but and I know you like to tell people things about the Middle Ages, like no, people were not dirty, they had really good teeth, and
Mm.
I'm all there with you, and I say no, the Victorians lied about a lot of things we that people think are true. It's just how
Well,
it
and
is.
is this why comedians make great guests on You're Dead to Me? Because in that sense, they're not presenting themselves as experts, so the audience doesn't feel intimidated. They are, in that sense, a sort of a way in for the person listening. But also, even me as I was an archaeologist. Um, for example, recently we were listening to the episode about Gilgamesh,
Yeah.
and I I didn't specialize in that period of history or that part of the world, but it was a fantastic way of not feeling bad about that. Funnily enough, because like. People often say to me, "Tell me about Gilgamesh," that kind of thing, and I don't know. Whereas actually, because you've got someone who's funny, but also someone who's accustomed to improvising, and also isn't in that sense afraid to look a little bit silly.
Yeah.
It's almost like the perfect stand-in for the audience, isn't it, as well?
That's the reason it works.
Mm,
I spent a year developing the format of You're Dead to Me before we released it to the public. So initially
mm,
we had two historians, one comedian, and it just didn't really work. There wasn't the kind of the natural balance. You kind of need that balance between the academic who's parting information and the comedian who is simultaneously receiving the information, processing it, and asking follow-up questions, but also is doing the kind of heavy lifting of doing jokes. And
mm.
the amazing thing, the reason the show works, we've been on air for 7 years now. We've just done our 150th episode.
Yes, about the telephone. Yes.
At the history of the telephone, yeah. The reason the show works is because I realized years ago, long before You're Dead to Me, I was spending a lot of time with comedians and I was spending a lot of time with historians, and I started to realize they've got very similar brains. And no one else had quite sort of clocked it because they're such different careers and there's such a
Mm.
different reputation. In the UK at least, historians are supposed to be sort of wearing tweed jackets and they're sort of meant to be quite pompous and they're meant to be old men, in tweed. And comedians, of course, are meant to be riotous rebels who are, don't care and don't, whatever. But actually, they've got really similar brains and their attitude to information is very familiar to each other. They both are analytical. They both like to pull things apart and go, why? Really? Says who? I don't believe it. They both are extraordinarily good at communicating complicated things in a way that is surprising and delightful. It's a good communicator as a historian or an archaeologist or as a broadcaster is someone who can take a complex idea about a civilization long gone and make them feel human and familiar. And a comedian does the same. A comedian can take something incredibly obvious and do observational comedy about it, which is they can make a joke that feels fresh and new, but it's about a thing that we all do. And that's an amazing skill. And then you've got the opposite, which is the comedian can take a surreal idea, Eddie Izzard style, and run with a completely bonkers notion and make that feel familiar too. And we realized, well, I realized early on that by pairing these people up, you're getting the best of both. You're getting extraordinary knowledge and passion, someone who's skilled at communicating, someone who's really good at explaining why this is actually more complex than you realize. But you're also getting someone whose brain works at 1,000 miles an hour,
Hmm.
because comedians are trained to think on their feet. They have to do stand up in front of hecklers, in front of strangers. They do crowd work. They are forced by training, by years and years and years on the circuit. They are forced to be able to think and process information instantly, transform it into a joke, and then at the same time pull it apart and dismantle it and go, but hang on a minute, you said this, but that doesn't hold because this. And those two skill sets, when you combine them, it makes a really good radio, because they're both doing something surprising and interesting, and they're both enjoying the subject, and they're both enjoying each other's company. And I'm there as the host, making sure that both of them feel safe and able to laugh and able to go, but actually it's more complex than that. And I obviously pivot between the two roles. I have two masks effectively. I'm both historian Greg, and I'm also comedy Greg. I'm not as funny as the comedians, but I love comedy, and I'm very happy to sort of set them up and give them a setup so they can do a punchline, or we can do one up each other. So the reason You're Dead to Me hopefully works is because there is an unlikely alliance that happens between comedians and historians and archaeologists, of course, that people wouldn't expect to happen, but when it does happen, it's really lovely, and we keep finding it. We've done 158 episodes, I think now, and we've never had a single episode that didn't work. We've had a couple where it was a little bit harder, slightly, a couple where you're like, okay, this one slightly having to just guide the guests in one direction, but we've never had a single episode that we couldn't broadcast.
But there were some that even you would think very surprising that wouldn't work. I think my favorite episode, I think, is the early medieval papacy, which was just so mental. And it was so wonderful and really surprised the people the guests who were there. But really, even in comedy, comedians have to have an incredible memory to
Yeah,
to be able to remember their routines, and then if they're in the middle of their routine and then to come back to it.
yeah,
It even I think history and comedy have been together literally since the beginning. One of the oldest jokes in the world is the joke from Mesopotamia about the
yeah,
dog that goes into a bar and can't see anything. And then you have both comedians and historians going, but wait, why is that funny?
yeah,
And yeah, so
yeah,
I think
yeah.
they've been together since the beginning, and that's also
Hundred
partly why
percent,
it works.
100%. And I love the history of comedy. It's one of the things I'm fascinated by. That's what my PhD would have been on. I would have been, my PhD would have been on jokes in Chaucer and sort of satirical comedy in the sort of 14th century, maybe slightly earlier, maybe 13th century. But I'm fascinated by how do jokes work, and is there a universality to jokes? Do Roman jokes work now? So I quite often, when I do public events, I tell Roman jokes to see if the audience laughs, and it's really interesting. Like, some of them work, some of them require quite careful translation, or you've got to put them in the idiom that makes sense. Some of them require like a kind of gloss where you have to explain the context, and some of them don't work. And you think, right, well that's interesting. Something's changed. So the universality of humor is also really interesting to me. That some things are just consistently funny no matter. The oldest joke in the entire world, as you say, is a Bronze Age joke. It's a Mesopotamian joke. It's a fart joke. It's the oldest joke we have. And it's about a wife farting on her husband's lap, and you're like,
Yes.
that's funny, right? But it's not, linguistically. I mean, as a linguist, Michelle, you might not find it that funny because it's got a double negative in it, and double
Oh, that
negatives,
doesn't
Ah.
matter. That's
double
all.
negatives are hard in jokes, right? Because the audience has
Yeah.
to be able to track the double negative canceling each other out. It's hard. You never want a double negative in a punchline, but a fart joke about a wife who sits on her husband's lap and farts on him. That's the oldest joke we have in human history, and you can tell that to a 6-year-old, and they're like, "Ha, you said fart," and it's like, okay, great, that works. So I love that comedy and history are sort of surprising bedfellows, and that's my entire career is comedy and history working in tandem. But what's really nice about it is we don't have to dumb down the historians at all. We
No.
bring on people with PhDs, we bring on scholars. They're professors, they are eminent in their field. They've written books on the subject that are considered to be, important works of scholarship. And we sit them down and say, tell us about this subject. And at no point do we say, sorry, that's too complex. We never say, dumb it down. All we say is, could you just make it, a short block of information so the comedian can process it, listen, do a joke, and then back we go to another bit of chat. And by the end of it, you've received, hopefully, a university level education in the subject. and you've laughed as well. That's the hope.
Mm.
Even in Horrible Histories, I think one of the reasons, many reasons why it worked is you didn't treat children as idiots,
No,
and you told them complex things, but in a way that they could understand it.
which is that we wanted it to be a show for kids. And the lovely surprise was that parents started watching it with their kids. And
Yes.
then we
Yeah.
realized adults were watching it without kids at all. And then you're like, oh, okay, now we've sort of created a cult show that students are watching. But the
Yeah.
idea was to empower children with information. Absolutely, Michelle.
Same thing with us when we were growing up with things like Animaniacs and Pinky and the Brain. Those
Sure.
those cartoons were, even though they were meant for children, they had adult jokes in them. And parents would watch them and laugh along with them. And I think that's why they worked so well. And it makes me sad we don't have that much like that nowadays. But
Well, Bluey. So Bluey's the biggest TV show in the world at the
yes,
moment, and my daughter is still old enough, luckily, to still watch Bluey. And Bluey is a show that is extraordinarily sophisticated because it's funny for everyone, and it's also profound for everyone.
yeah,
Like children learn life lessons from it, but the parents are the ones who are often moved the most because it's got storylines about miscarriage and about
Yeah.
your own parents aging and kind of the doubt about am I a good father or mother, or is this the right way to parent? And it's sort of 7 minutes of kind of laughter and giggles, but also these sort of philosophical lessons. But of course, Mark, as an archaeologist, you will know that the creator of Bluey, or you might not know, but the creator of Bluey is the brother of a very renowned archaeologist.
Oh no,
So,
which one?
so the creator of the show is called Joe Brum, and
Okay.
his brother is Professor Adam Brum, who
Yeah, yeah.
is a renowned archaeologist who works on Stone Age art in Southeast Asia, and recently pushed back the oldest known human art. We sort of moved that back by 15,000 years, and
Yeah.
so sort of state of the art archaeological research is being quietly celebrated in Bluey because Bandit the dog is an archaeologist, and he works on
Wonderful.
paleo dog bones. And there's a little comedy sketch on YouTube which I love, which is him presenting at a conference. They found the oldest ever canine bone of an upright canid, and the joke at the end, of course, is that he gnaws on the bone because he can't help it. He's a dog.
Of course.
But he
Yeah, yeah.
presents, he's talking about the morphology of the bone. He's talking about the density. He's talking about, kind of muscle attachments. And this would be an upright
That's
canine. He's
wonderful.
doing
Yeah,
all the science terms. And yet at the end, he then gnaws on the bone and there's your punchline. But
yeah.
it's amazing, right? This is a kid for 5-year-olds. It's a show for 5-year-olds. But at the heart of it is this quiet little, very gentle allusion to archaeology just in the background, which is really
Yeah.
lovely.
I had
Yeah.
no idea that they were actually related. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool, isn't it?
That's super cool. Just before we move on, Michelle, one thing that I can say doesn't translate from Roman times all the time
It's Nightman
is
Morris.
Nine Men's Morris and board games
The
sometimes. Yeah,
game.
yeah. Just sometimes they can be rough. Yeah. Trying to explain to kids this was fun. Like, I'm like, not sure. I'm not convinced. Not convinced.
We've talked a lot
Yeah.
about presenting to people. So, Greg, in your estimation, what makes somebody a public historian?
That's a really good question. I think I've struggled sometimes to define what I mean by it. For a long time, I didn't know what to call myself because I didn't feel adequately trained to call myself a historian because I didn't have the PhD. I felt like I wasn't a historian, really. I felt like I hadn't quite got all my grades. So there was a spell where I sort of flip-flopped around and couldn't quite work it out. And then public historian was an American phrase, I think. I think that's certainly where I discovered it. I started using it because it felt like it encapsulated my skill set and my ambitions, which is that I
Mm.
wanted to do history that was broad and accessible, but sort of, based in scholarship, not just sort of facts and little kind of throwaway little lines, but rather thinking about the past, like conceptualizing it, problematizing it, thinking about what was it like to live in the past and what are the issues that we face as historians or archaeologists or linguists where we are trying to solve questions of like, well, hang on, do we know this is true? Is this just, we've got a very small amount of evidence that's survived and actually that's biasing the record in one direction? So when people say you're a popular historian, I often say, no, I'm a public historian. And the definition I tend to use is that popular history, I think, speaks to it preaches to the choir. I think if you
Mm.
do popular history, you're probably already writing or broadcasting for an audience of people who already like history. They already enjoyed it
Mm.
at school. They may have grown up. They may have studied it at university. Who knows? But that for them is an enjoyable field of sort of leisure, right? They kind of read for fun, they read for pleasure, they listen to podcasts because they like to learn
People who
about the
listen to
world.
classic FM, for example.
Yeah, people
Yeah.
who are
Mm.
they're not intimidated or switched off. For
Yeah.
me, public history needs to go beyond that.
Mm.
Public history, I believe, needs to find a way to connect with everyone. And history should be for everyone. We should all be able to rejoice and embrace and problematize the past. We should all be able to have an understanding of where our society comes from, why the world is the way it is, why we speak the languages we do, why we eat the foods we do. And I think public history needs to make sure that it's in conversation or in dialogue, or at least within reach of everyone, which for me means children, because that's really important. You've got to start that conversation early so children grow up not intimidated, not scared by the past. And also, I think it means grabbing people for whom history was awful at school. They hated it. It was boring and irrelevant. And they're like, why am I learning this nonsense about the Great Reform Act of 1832? Who gives a damn? Like, I just want to go and smoke cigarettes and try and get off with hot people. I'm not remotely interested in the Corn Laws. To which I would sort of say, yeah, okay, I can appreciate that because I meet so many people who sort of come up to me, maybe when I'm doing a book tour or if I'm doing a live event, where they'll come up to me and say, I hated history at school. And I wish I had you as a teacher, which is a sort of compliment. It's nice in some ways, but it makes me sad because it means that they were let down at some point because it's not that the subject wasn't the issue. The issue was the approach. Like they weren't, they weren't maybe ready for it at that age, or maybe they just weren't given the opportunity for history to be for them, because there needs to be lots of different ways to do history. If you're going to get everyone, you've got to do lots of different ways. My approach will not work for everyone. Some people find me annoying. That's completely understandable. I am annoying. Some people find me, some people find me flippant or whatever. There needs to be like a multitude of approaches that you can deploy, so that if you have someone who is resistant and says, I don't want to learn about history, I don't care. If my approach doesn't work, that can't be the end of it. You need to then go, no worries, because there's this person over here and they do something completely different. And that might be video games. That might be music. That might be history of sport. It might be the history of fashion. It could be the history of languages. It might be that they are someone whose family story starts in a different continent and they're from a different background culturally and they've grown up maybe in the UK, but their parents or grandparents have moved here from somewhere else. They may not connect with the Tudors. They might be like, well, I don't really care. It's not really my family story. My family story is something else. To which you might say, okay, let's talk about your family story. Let's find a way in so that you're not switching off the history button altogether. Like, we don't want people to shut down completely and just go, nope, don't do history, not for me. What we want to offer them, I think, is to say, okay, you don't like this bit of history, but that's fine, because here are 37,000 other stories that we can do instead.
Well, and that's the thing, is that people often talk about, and I think erroneously, they'll say history is written by the winners. And they tend to forget that actually lots of histories continue in parallel with each other. It's just that often, say, in national curricula or or sort of received wisdom, people will learn certain bullet points almost by rote. And it almost feels as though getting beyond catering for, I suppose, a sense of almost teaching people or talking to people about what they kind of already sort of know. Some of the best history out there is the stuff that actually is surprising. So I mean, very briefly, one of my favorite things to do in a school setting is just to say to the kids, if we're talking about Romans, we're not going to talk about the army until the end. And they go, oh. And when you present to them just how weird Romans actually were, despite the fact that we have this sort of post-Victorian sense of familiarity with them, just how weird actually their day-to-day lives were.
With the Roman, so I wrote a book last year or 2 years ago about Roman Britain, and I co-wrote it with a fantastic a Roman historian called Dr. Emma Southern. And the joy of that book was that I learned loads about the Romans, and it sort of revealed to me that I'm a professional historian, and there was loads of stuff I did not know. And when I say I did not know, I meant like complete shock to me, like things that I was like, really? We had a British Empire for 10 years. You're like, yeah. There was a guy who had his own brief empire where he split off from the Roman Empire, and he just for a little while, for about 10 years, He had his own empire, and then he was murdered by his accountant. And you're like, okay, great. Did not know that. And so there's this sort of weird lull in British Roman history where for a little while we're not even in the Roman Empire. We've got our own little breakaway empire. And that's funny. That's a funny little thing. And so when I started doing book talks, I'd go around and do talks and public events for, for kids and their parents. And I have this sort of slideshow and I do a sort of hour-long talk, which is a long time for a child to sit still. An hour. I'm talking at them for 58 minutes or so. And I've got a slideshow with about 70 slides in it, and a lot of them are funny, and some of them are illustrated and they're cartoons or whatever. But I spend quite a lot of time just explaining to them, none of this stuff you will hear at school, and it's all true. It all happened. And how do we know this stuff? And I'll get them to start thinking about how do we learn things? How do we acquire information? How do we disprove things? How do we judge what's true and not true? And it's really fun to sort of get them to think conceptually about studying the Romans almost as an experimental methodology for studying anything. Like you start with a culture that lived here in this country but weren't from this country. They invaded this country and then they changed it. But what were they really like? What did they value? What was successful about them? Why were they successful? Well, they sort of combined two great things: extreme violence and surprising tolerance for religious belief. So like they kind of smash your armies, crush you and enslave some of them, and then they go, all right, we're here now. You can keep your gods. And it's like, oh, that's surprisingly chill for people who've just murdered my family, but okay, thank you. And you get this sort of weird tension where the Romans are simultaneously brutal and also oddly laissez-faire. And for kids, that's quite surprising too. They can sort of go, oh, well, they're not awful all the time. No, they're not awful all the time. So I think it's really fun to give or give adults, a kind of a complicated, almost like an oxymoron. You can sort of go, look, these two things are simultaneously true, and yet they seem like opposites. And that could be really interesting and surprising. And one of the nice ways of making history more thrillingly complex. It's more than a simple story. Lord Nelson's not just a hero, and the British Empire is not just this sort of great edifice that is good, or
I refuse to believe
evil.
it.
Yeah, these things are multifaceted. And certainly with kids, you usually start with toilet humor because that's naturally funny. And of course, the Romans went to the toilet without cubicles. For them, it's all about, it's a social space. Going to the toilet is a social space. You go sit next to strangers and you chat, and you pass each other the wiping material. You have the Zero the sponge on a stick, and there's art on the wall, and there is in mood lighting, and people hang out in the loos, and you're like, this is completely counter to what we do. We go into the toilets, we close the door, and we do our business, and we get out as fast as we can. And it's just really interesting. The Romans have a very different attitude to public and private space, and their bodily functions are part of that, and their level of embarrassment is different to ours. And it's just funny to start with toilets, because toilets are universal. Everyone on the planet has to go to the loo. We all have to defecate and urinate or we die. So that's a great starting point for any kind of conversation with a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You stand in front of kids and you go, "Who goes to the bathroom?" "I do."
Yeah, exactly. And they laugh at it. They laugh at farts. They laugh at we. But actually, it's a really good question. When you build the first ever city, the first ever town, the Çatalhöyük in the Neolithic in Turkey, like, where do you put all the poo?
Where'd you put it? Yeah.
The first big problem, right? Where does it go? What do you do with it? Are you going to recycle it? Are you going to fertilize your fields? Are you going to build with it? Are you going to use it as a building material? Are you going to insulate your walls with it? Are you going to take it far away? Are you going to put it in the water supply? Like, there's all these questions about where does the poo go? Because it's a really important civilizational question. Where does the poo go?
Yeah.
These are things that unite people. And when I teach kids, I often have kids who they love me the why questions, and I love the why questions. And so one of my students said to me the other day, "Why do we have time zones?" And I said, "That's a wonderful question. Let's talk about Sir Sanford, and let's talk about the things that he did. Let's talk about whether or not he was Canadian. He was Scottish, but there's a whole, because Canada wasn't a country then. But there's a whole the thing that I've discovered even with my students is they love history, but they're not learning the things that they want to know. I had a student who had asked, where did writing come from? And so we talked about things like cuneiform. We talked about the Phoenician alphabet. And he never learned these things in school. And so
Mm.
the things that he's curious about are just not covered in the curriculum. And I think that is also, as you were saying before, one of the failings is that we're teaching for standardized tests and we're not teaching
Yeah,
to curiosity. And I think that the curiosity is where we're failing people because people are
yes,
naturally curious and they want
they
to
are.
know.
They are, and I think that the huge I often get asked, how would you redesign the school curriculum for children? I
Mm.
think it's an impossible job. I think it's so difficult because there's too much history. There's just too much. Um, but also, if you do it chronologically, then you aren't really engaging with the ancient world at
Hmm.
any serious level because your
No.
6-year-olds can barely process time at all. So all you're doing
Mm.
really is just talking about Julius Caesar and the Romans had a Colosseum and they did, they did gladiators and that's it. That's the level you can get to with a 6-year-old. So by definition, you kind of you race through the chronology, and the more sophisticated the child becomes, the more capable they are of bigger thinking and of reading longer books. You're by definition you are assigning more weight and importance to
Mm.
more modern history, more recent history. So you're saying, right, okay, you're 14 now. Now we can do the 18th century, but you've completely ignored the Roman world, or you've
Yeah.
ignored the Babylonians, or cuneiform, or the Stone Age, or you've just not taken any kind of interest in ancient China because
Hmm.
at 7 or 8, you just sort of do it. You do it in a week. You kind of go, yeah, 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 Alfred the Great, it's sort of Great Wall of China, bosh, bosh, bosh. Now on to the important stuff. We've got to talk about constitutional government, and
Yeah.
that's a huge shame. It's a huge shame because a 15-year-old could learn so much thinking about the Greeks, thinking so much about Southeast Asia or the Harappan Indus civilization or Mesoamerica and the Aztecs. And there's the problem with chronologies is as the children get older,
Hmm.
you're expecting them to think harder, and that means that you create a bias in what it is
Mm.
they're meant to care about. But also, to a certain extent, you start forcing them to have to care deeply about things they probably don't care about naturally. As they get
Mm.
towards the 19th century, the 20th century, and you're sort of waving things at them that are, if it is education reform or constitutional this and that, if it's some sort of tariff bill, you're talking about American tariffs or whatever, and free trade versus liberalism versus tariffs versus, it's like, oh, God, I don't care about this stuff when you're 14, 15.
Mm.
What they care about is the Greek gods who are absolutely mad, and they want to know about how does it work in ancient Rome, like who gets to be senator, how does it work, how do you get power, what are they eating, why are they eating that, what was it like to go to a gladiatorial arena, how
Garum, lots of garum.
garum sauce, right? Yeah. What's the
Everywhere.
view
Yeah.
like when you go to a Greek play? Can you hear all the words, or is it
Mm.
mostly miming? Like, is why are the plays so long? Do people not get
Mm.
bored? Like this. There's so many questions they might want to ask, but we
Mm.
kind of end up going, no, no, you've got to care about this thing over here. And
Well,
sure, it's important.
so, that's one of the ironies about the way that history is taught is that often I'm sure you must have this on online all the time as well. This thing of people saying stick in your lane, don't get political, for example.
Yeah.
And yet the framework of history teaching, when people are more conscious of what they're learning, is explicitly about national identity and political structures. In a funny sort of way, and also, of course, never mind the fact that no politician on earth doesn't use history
Yeah.
to reference a glorious past and set out a vision for the future, a
Hmm.
trajectory in that sense. It's fascinating that as you say, possibly one of the ways we get of fixing that would be to have some of the more metaphorical, more of the more sort of experimental. Here's a petri dish of prehistory. How would you set up an economy, for example? How would you make a stone tool? A much more creative approach
Mm.
later in time, and maybe yeah, don't bombard the kids with Victorian stuff. Yeah. Hmm.
You know my feeling. I would just remove all the Victorian things entirely.
Yeah.
I
Green
like the
Man. No.
Victorians. The Victorians they're a intriguing bunch, but but that's the other thing, isn't it? I think what's so funny is that we've all used these phrases like Roman, Victorians, whatever. We've all kind of accepted the kind
Hmm.
of the
Hmm.
era that we grew up teaching. But obviously, when you look at them, you kind of go, "What is the Victorian era?" what is it really one era? Is it two eras? You know, in my book Ask a Historian, I make a kind of ridiculously sort of deliberately provocative case. I'm like, I don't think there is such a thing as a Victorian era. Um, because you look at 1837 and you look at 1901, everything has changed.
Hmm.
The world is different. Like the technology has it's moved on immeasurably. And the only thing that's consistent is that one lady is still alive. Queen Victoria is still clinging on. If she dies 17 years earlier, nothing else. It's just such an arbitrary measure, and
Mm.
it only becomes obvious when you then point to Queen Elizabeth II and say, "Okay, so we're all Elizabethans, are we?" And everyone goes, "No, we're not Elizabethans. And then they go, "Oh, what are we? Like, how do we define ourselves? What is our era right now? How are we gonna?" You know,
Carolean?
Michelle, you're in Canada, right? I'm
Yes.
in England. Mark, are you in England? Where are you based?
Northeast. I'm in Wallsend, Hadrian's Wall.
Lovely.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
great. You're on Hadrian's Wall. Lovely.
yeah.
So we're calling it. We're using technology to talk to each other in real time across the world, across an ocean. So what is this era then? Is this the technology era? Are we in the internet era? Is this the binary era? Is this the fossil fuel era? Is this the
The
era of
Musk era.
the Elon Musk era? Are we in the AI era? Are we? Is this? Are we
Yeah.
going to call this the kind of the pre-collapse era? Are we about to head towards enormous environmental
Mm.
and ecological disaster? So
We'll
is
find
this?
out in 20 years.
Yeah, stay tuned, kids. But like when you go to name an era, you realize how incredibly reductive it is to call it the
Mm.
Tudors, who didn't even call themselves Tudors,
Yeah, they
right?
didn't even call themselves that. Yeah,
They were
exactly.
embarrassed
Yeah.
by the name. They didn't call themselves Tudors. The Aztecs didn't call themselves Aztecs. The Vikings didn't call themselves Vikings. The,
Nope.
the Byzantines didn't say, "Hi, we're the Byzantines." They're Romans. Nobody called themselves what we call them, and it's really funny how we can walk around.
Mm.
Everyone is on the same page, like, "Oh yeah, yeah, we know what the Tudors are," but it's a phrase we've all just sort of decided to swallow, but it's not true. And so there's all these sort of things that we internalize when we're kids that stay, they feel like they're kind of permanent edifices of knowledge in our head. And they're not true. And the first time I
Mm.
sort of realized that was when we were doing Horrible Histories, and I would be in the writer's room with all our sort of team of writers, like 20 odd people or so, sat around a table. And I had all these different eras that I had to sort of communicate the history for. Every week we do a different era. And I did a timeline on the wall because I wanted to gauge the general knowledge of the writers to see how good they were. And a couple of them had good knowledge, had studied history at university. Some of them had no idea. And so we did a fun little game. It was a bit like a kind of game show, like higher or lower, sort of Bruce Forsyth
Yeah.
style, where I'd be like, okay, I've got all these eras. What's going first? And they'd be like, Stone Age. I'd be like, yes, Stone Age is correct. Okay. But then I'd get to Saxons and Vikings, and I'd say, okay, which one goes first, Saxons or
Saxons.
Vikings? And they'd go, and I'd say, uh-huh. And now we get to the Maya. Where does the Maya go? And they'd be like, I've no idea. And they'd put it ancient. They'd put it alongside Egypt. And I go, no, the Maya are medieval. They're alongside, they're over here with Henry VIII. And so, or not quite Henry VIII, slightly earlier, Edward III, I suppose. But they couldn't work out where these overlapping eras went. And I suddenly realized, because they're not separate eras.
Mm.
They're just arbitrary categories we've created to try and make sense of this.
I mean, another one that really messes with people is when you realize the Romans are Iron Age people.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? It wasn't the Iron Age then, the Roman period. It's the Romans had Iron Age technology. They didn't have
Yeah.
steel. Another one though that I really enjoy is there's one period of history that's definitely going to change its name.
Oh,
Can you guess which one it is?
Don't say the
Oh.
D word, Mark. Do not say
No,
the
no,
D
it's
word.
not. It's not the D word. No, it's
no, I'm struggling. Go on, tell me.
yeah, the medieval period, because it won't be
Oh,
midway between now and
yeah,
classical world, will it?
you're right.
Well, was
My
it?
daughter,
Was it at all in the first
Well,
place? No.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
but I mean,
but yeah,
yes.
it'd be like the 2/3 period.
Well, I was explaining to my daughter yesterday. She said, "Daddy, what's medieval history?" And I said,
Mm,
"Oh, it's the history in the middle." And she said, "The middle of what?" And I
yeah,
said, "The middle of everything." And she went, "Oh, so the middle of the Stone Age and everything, because they're doing the Stone Age at school." And I said,
yeah,
"Oh, no, not remotely. No, because if that's your criteria,
yeah,
then there is no Middle Ages, and because the Stone Age is 3.3 million years, so the Middle
yeah,
Ages then would have to be like 1.6 million years ago. It doesn't make any sense. So
Yeah.
I
Well, the
immediately
Renaissance also, the Renaissance makes
right.
no sense at all.
No,
And
no.
And I love winding up Renaissance scholars by saying to them, "Oh, so you're a medievalist then?" And they'd be like, "No, I'm a Renaissance
Yeah.
scholar." And I'd be like, "Well,
Yeah.
that's medieval history still, isn't it?" I
But
mean,
also things like the Holy Roman Empire seeing themselves as a continuation in
yeah,
that sense, and even in this country through the Middle Ages, there was this sort of sense of, oh, well, we're still part of that,
absolutely.
and yet fascinating how
And
we just sort
the
of
fall
part
of
them in.
Constantinople in 1453, that's the end of the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Or is it?
Or is it? I mean,
Or is
you
it?
know,
Yeah, is it?
so there's all these
Russians,
sort of
yes.
amazing, but that's the joy. I did an event recently in Barnsley, and Barnsley's in the north of England, and I went up and I had a really lovely day. I walked around, and there was they had some beautiful public art. They had really nice museums and galleries, and I had a really nice time. And then I did an event in the evening, which was just a public event where people could ask me anything about history. And I just said, "Have you noticed your war memorial? Have you noticed when it's First World War? Have you noticed when it says the war ended?" And they all went, 1918. I said, "No, look at the war memorial. It says
Hmm.
1919 on it."
Hmm.
And we all go to school saying the First World War lasted 1914 to 1918.
No,
But if you
no.
turn to any First World War scholar, they immediately go, "Ah, yes. So there are 5 theories about this, and it depends who you talk to. But comfortably, most would be like 1919. A lot would be like, well, I mean, technically, the U.S. constitutional wartime powers continued until like 1921, I think it is.
Hmm.
But there are some scholars like Robert Geowath who would argue, well, actually, the First World War just continued in parts of Europe and just carried on, and you just get a
The
continuation of
20th
that
century
war.
war. Yeah.
It literally is, and
Yeah.
it's amazing how you can literally walk past a public monument that says 1914 to 1919 on it, and we all just go 1918. 1918 is when it ended, and we carry around all these false ideas in our head, and part of the joy of being a public historian is sort of going, let's just stop and think about it for a second, because is that true?
Are these shorthands useful, do you think?
I think they can be. I think obviously they can help us. I mean, as you say, they can be deployed politically, as we know.
Mm.
So you can have both problematized and positive deployments of history. Of course, history is a resource; it's an idea; it belongs to all of us. But it can be weaponized, and it can also be used to undercut racist narratives or difficult narratives. But I think there is something to be said for having these simple versions of history in our head, because it helps us organize a sort of understanding of the world. It's helpful to understand the ancient world versus the modern world,
Mm.
even if the category deployment of when does that end is really difficult to navigate. You go 1453, technically, if you want the end of the Roman Empire, but that's not ancient, is it? That's well into medieval. It's almost early modern. So
Hmm. Hmm.
476, end of the ancient world? Well, it depends how you feel about late antiquity and Peter Brown, so I don't know. I think these
And we certainly
categories
don't mention Gibbon on this channel.
Poor Gibbon, he did his best. He wrote his big book.
Did he
Um,
though? It's like me and Sir James Fraser. Did he
yeah,
really do
yeah. I
his? I
mean,
Give it
don't
a
think so.
chance. Give it a chance. Sorry.
it's, it's funny that I keep meeting people who are like, "Why did the Roman Empire fall?" And I'm like, "How long have you got?" Like,
Mm.
it's. I mean,
I would just answer that with the did it though? And,
Mm.
did it though
and
is another question, isn't it? Did it? Is it still with us? But I think Mark, your point. Are these shortcuts helpful? I think they probably are. I think we'd
Mm.
struggle to walk around with an endlessly mutable, sophisticated, overlapping hierarchy of information in our heads. I think we sort of need those basic neural anchors, as I said earlier, to sort of just go,
Mm.
yeah, this is, for my sins, I know very little about the history of Canada. So in my head, it's like British French colony, and then independence, and then nothing, and then World War One, and then that's sort of and I'm a public historian. I should know this stuff, and I'm acutely aware of it, and I want to know more about it. I'm gonna do more to read about it. But there are things in my head that are super basic about your country. The place of your birth, and perhaps of your education, and perhaps of your expertise, Michelle. I don't know what you teach particularly, but you know way more about Canada than I do. And that's because you grew up there, right?
Well, no, I actually know way more
Oh.
about Canada than most Canadians do because I had to take the citizenship test. So
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah, so I
okay.
actually I actually grew up in the States, but I was partially educated here, and
Right.
so but I did have to take the citizenship test only to discover there is an entire textbook that you need to know about,
Yeah.
and you have to know your dates, and it's not just about the government, but they force you to learn everything about, and I knew more than most people growing up here knew because again, they had to
Mm.
learn to take tests. I had to learn the whole breadth of Canadian history, which is a textbook about this big, plus an
Yeah.
audiobook that goes with it.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's free online. Anybody, if you want to go to discovercanada.ca, you can
Yep.
anybody
You've
is
sent me there. Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
anybody is
Yep.
free to Mark and I did a fake citizenship test to see how much he knew. Actually, if you know a little bit about British history, you'll know a little bit about
Right.
Canadian history.
Sure.
Yeah.
And as well some French history as
Parliament as
well.
well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly how
Mm.
Parliament works.
Yeah.
It's almost the same. We don't have a House of Lords, haha. But we do have other things. We have a Senate, but the Senate doesn't work the same as the states. It's completely different. It works more like
Right.
your House of Lords. So I had to learn all of those things, only to discover that most Canadians don't know them. Like
Right.
most Canadians don't know that Newfoundland was not part of Canada until 1949. It was a separate British entity. Many Canadians don't know that we
Mm.
have a piece of France here in Canada that is technically part of France, and it's been part of France since the French Wars. So that's just how it is.
Yeah.
So we
See,
we know a lot. We have a lot of those things, but and as well as I said with Sir Sanford, he was born and raised in Scotland. We learned that he is not Canadian, but you probably learned that he is Canadian
yeah.
because
Mm.
he came over. He came over in the early 1800s when Canada was not a country. It was the province of Canada, which was Upper and Lower Canada, and it didn't exist as a country until 1867.
But
So.
crucially, you
Mhm.
know what good East Coast pizza is
I
and what
do.
good poutine is as well. So
Excuse me,
you
Mark.
get New
Excuse me.
York.
It's
Is it
Putin.
Putin?
Putin. We
Putin.
don't
Putin.
commit
Sorry.
that sin in front
Sorry.
of my
I'm sorry. I
face.
was like,
Thank you.
Yeah.
yeah.
None
You
of it,
benefit
Putin.
from
No.
both. Yeah.
But that's really interesting that you took the test. You know, I've had friends who've done the UK citizenship test and they've sort of run questions past me, and I've had to go. Hang on, give me a second. I know this one, but I've had to like rack in the back of my memory because yeah, some of those questions are like, is this knowledge important?
Mm.
You know, do I need to know what year the kind of it's important that I know what year Magna Carta occurred. Well,
Yeah.
Do you
yeah,
what
maybe.
was because Americans love to love to
Well,
talk about
what?
Magna Carta, but what did Magna Carta really do? Was it really
Yeah,
important?
that's such an interesting question. I mean,
Mm.
Mark, how do you feel about Magna Carta? I'm going to throw it back at you.
Well, I feel quite happy that it happened. No, no. I mean, years ago, I did a week long sort of series of little bits and bobs about Magna Carta, and it is important. But actually, funnily enough, you mentioned that test. One of the weird ones that I remember a friend of mine came to with this question was it was a question about in how would you consume public news? I think it was it did it I think it was something along the lines of what year did public news start being broadcast in cinemas, like in essentially like
Ah,
Nickelodeon type theaters?
This is for a
mm,
citizenship test?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it was surprisingly early. It was like I think it might have been the late 1800s. It wasn't even just it wasn't. They were suggesting like the 1930s, and I was like, well, of course, 1930s. That makes sense.
mm,
No, earlier than
But
that for
but
sure.
but sometimes the knowledge can be quite, yeah, as you say, extremely niche, and you sort of think, do people really need to know this to be here? But also it's I guess it comes back to that question about the function of history, doesn't it? And this
yeah,
idea of and that especially we talked about it in the context of curricula. We talked about it in the context of things like the public interacting and having that gateway through comedy. Um, I guess I suppose I always just come to the conclusion that just the more history you know, especially about where you are, the less likely you are to feel the need to get your identity from somewhere else or from someone else or to have it given to you in that sense. Um, just having a sense of how you got here has to be good for you, I guess.
No, you have,
Really.
especially Greg, you have that dual background of being both
yeah,
French and English.
Yeah.
yeah. It's a really good point, Mark. And I don't know if I would challenge your point because I'm not sure that what you're saying is in any way controversial. I'm not sure if I've given it that much thought to have a sort of a seasoned argument. But I think growing up sort of by
Well, can I put it into a quick context for
Yeah,
you? Sorry.
yeah,
So, for example, here in the Northeast, or where I grew up in North Wales, there's often a sense, especially amongst kids in primary schools, that you need to go elsewhere to learn your history. So in the
right.
Northeast, you go to London or you go to York, or in North Wales, wasn't really anywhere other than places in England that we would regularly go to. And you actually, I would say, in the past 20 years or so, giving people a little bit of that sense of parallel histories
Mm.
has been so powerful and so useful. I don't know if that helps clarify what I was getting at there at all.
That's really interesting. I think from my point of view, growing up, I was very English culturally. I'm very English. My French is
Mm,
terrible, and I look French, but I sound English. Um, I was aware of being French, of course. My mother's French. We'd go to Paris all the time, and I was always just sort of startled by the way in which Napoleon was a hero in France.
mm,
He was so important. He's so elevated. He's so memorialized. He's a great guy in France. And in Britain,
mm.
he's like, we've got to stop this man and then we'll build a railway station to commemorate it. He's the big baddie. Napoleon is the chief enemy.
Yeah.
And it's, growing up as a kid, I was sort of really startled and intrigued by that notion that you can be these two things simultaneously. You can be
Yeah.
the hero of one country and the enemy of another. And then, of course,
Or
you
like
start
in
to get older.
Australia, people don't like Churchill, for example.
Right, I was
Yeah.
going to say, you
Yeah.
get older and
Yeah.
you start to realize Oliver Cromwell is,
Yeah.
loathed and detested in Ireland, and there's
Hmm.
a statue of him in Westminster, and you kind of go, hang on a
Mm,
minute, those two things don't feel like they should join up. And yes, Cromwell, Captain Cook in Australia is, controversial, of course.
mm,
There will be, General Gordon of Khartoum. There are sort of numerous 19th century sort of imperial soldiers and sailors and administrators whose reputations are probably pretty positive here or benign here in the UK and are probably quite controversial in the places where they committed certain atrocities or enforced certain laws.
mm.
But it was intriguing growing up as a kid to sort of see that one person could be these two different reputations simultaneously. And in terms of growing up where I grew up, I don't know what it is that sort of acculturated me to feel proudly English because I always felt sort of quite confused about my identity growing up. And I'm still slightly confused because when people say, what is your identity? I often say I'm British and French because those are my legal statuses. I've got a UK passport and a French passport,
Mm.
but I'm very English. And whenever I go to Scotland or Wales, which I love, I love going to Wales. I love going to Scotland. They're beautiful countries and, fascinating history, great people, good food, lovely places to spend time. But I'm always acutely aware I'm English. And
Mm.
you kind of go, oh, and you're sort of carrying with you the burden of what Edward the First did. There's a notion that you've sort of shown up planning to build a castle in their back garden. And I completely understand that. And if I go
Mm.
to Ireland, it's the same. I completely appreciate if you show up in Ireland as an Englishman, initially people are going to be like a little bit hesitant. They're going to be a little bit cautious because, you may be carrying with you political views or values that they might find pretty challenging or don't align with theirs. And so I'm always quite sensitive whenever I go places to just sort of say, I'm here because I'm a historian. I'm curious and I want to know about what the places I want to go to. Please tell me about your history. And I'm always
Mm.
grateful if I'm given a tour of a museum or if I get to visit somewhere and people will take the time to show me around. It's a wonderful thing to be invited to a place and to hear about their local history or their national history. It's a real privilege. But even in my own sense of identity, I occasionally find myself tripping over what it is I even define as. And I think it's slightly made more complicated when you get to the Olympics and we compete
Yeah.
as Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the Olympics, I think. And then you've got the United Kingdom when it gets to Eurovision. But
Mhm.
when it gets to the rugby, I think it changes again. And when it gets
Hmm.
to sort of a global, but then of course you've got England in the World Cup for the football for men and women. And also then obviously I've got France as well. I can sort of cheer for France in the rugby or the football or in Eurovision. So I often find myself like having to change flag midway depending on what
Yeah.
sport it is that I'm caring
Yeah.
about. And it's quite
Well,
confusing to be like,
it's,
you know,
so something that I've mentioned to Michelle before is that I grew up having to always qualify what I meant by the word national.
sure.
So if something was national, was it Welsh or was it UK?
Yeah.
That kind of that, and that when I got to uni, I went to uni here in the northeast of England, and bumping into so many English people who didn't have to think about that. For them, national was a very clear word. That was
Yeah.
fascinating as well. You never mind growing up bilingual, this kind of thing. Can I just ask you that? Because we've been talking about nuance,
Mm.
and I really want to know the nuance window. The nuance window.
Nuance
Um,
window. Yeah.
yeah, is it? Do you conceptualize it as literally a window? Because I always imagine it as something that someone's looking out of, or is it just a section of the show? And in that sense, it's crucial, isn't it? Because everything we've just been talking about is nuance, I guess.
Yeah, so it's my favorite part of the show, and it's
Yeah.
part of the thing I'm proudest of with You're Dead to Me. It's this little 2 minute lecture, little soapbox moment where our expert gets 2 minutes uninterrupted at the end of the show to say anything they want to say.
Hmm.
And the reason it's called the nuance window is that I wanted it to be a sort of the joke is if you listen to the audio, the window gets smashed. So if you sort of
Right.
listen, if you listen carefully, the window gets smashed. So the idea is that you're sort of putting a brick through it,
Okay.
in a way, sort of like you can look through the subject, but you can also smash it. You can also break through. The idea was to allow the academics to empower them to do whatever they wanted with that slot. So early on, I was able to say to them, look, you can, if you want, demolish everything we've just said.
Yeah.
So, and if you listen to the Boudica episode very, very early on in our series, that is
One
what
of
our
my
scholar did.
favorites.
She
Yeah.
just went, by the way, Boudica may not have existed. She only exists, we have archaeological evidence for a rebellion, sure, but we don't have any coins with her face on it or anything. And all we've got is a Rome, we've got Tacitus and we've got Dio
Cassius
Cassius.
Dio. That's it.
Yeah, we've got these two Roman men writing about her. And in many ways, she's very tropic. She feels like a real, like, literary trope character. And she's got these great speeches that feel very familiar to earlier speeches in Roman myth and legend. Is Boudica even real? And having spent 55 minutes talking about the Boudican Revolution, to then have a scholar go, well, maybe this is a thing that doesn't exist. You're like, bloody hell, that's a shocker. And so that was episode 1 that we recorded. And so having started on that foot, I really like that the nuance window allows for a historiographical baseball bat where you can absolutely smash the subject over the head and go, we don't know if these sources are true. We don't know how reliable they are. We don't know if all of these things happen. We don't know if we're assembling. There's that really famous Monty Python sketch that I absolutely love, which is where the museum curators find the shards of an ancient thing and they assemble it into a kind of giant pink elephant. And it's completely wrong. It's completely wrong. Because that's what happens when you find the shards of something and you try and assemble it. You'll
It's like
assemble
that
it into
first
something.
dinosaur, isn't it? That
Yeah,
weird
100%.
one. Yeah.
100%. In Crystal Palace, the first dinosaurs were assembled by people who had some medical anatomical training, and they went, I think dinosaurs look like this. And you're like, they definitely did not look like that. But that's the thing, like, as historians and archaeologists, as linguists, are we, when we're presented with the shards of evidence left behind to us, often incredibly small little bits of evidence, we often, certainly in the Middle Ages, certainly in the ancient world, for example, you may have a literary corpus, but you might just be, for the Indus Valley civilization, we have no texts at all, right? So it's just archaeology. So you're trying to get to grips with, like, who were these people? What did they believe? Did they have gods? Well, they probably did, but we can't know that. Did they have language? Of course they must have done, but we don't know what it is. What do they eat? Well, we can use isotopic analysis on their bones to sort of go, oh, they ate beef. Okay, that's interesting, because you'd think maybe they perhaps didn't eat beef because of the sort of the geography of the area, but no, they ate beef. Okay, fine. So they're beef-eating people. Do they have a kind of? They don't seem to have walls or defensive weapons. They don't seem to have swords. So are they a peacekeeping people? Are they some sort of like golden halcyon civilization with no war, or have we just not found the army camp that's sort of built, buried over there? And you realize actually that you can build up these very glamorous, very sophisticated pictures of a civilization, but are you building it up from 3% of the data? And maybe you've completely drawn a giant pink elephant, as Monty Python have done, or the opposite, or are we actually really quite good at assembling enough information to piece together what really happened? If we got in a time machine right now, the three of us, and we jump back, would we recognize the scene at 12:15 Magna Carta being? Would we go, oh, there's King John, and there he is. There's his Magna Carta, lovely.
And they're in the dirt. Okay.
But if we went back to ancient Rome, with what we know about the Romans, we know about Garum Source and the gladiators and how their political system works, and we know Latin, and we know Roman art, and we know about Roman hairstyles, and we know about Roman shoes, and would we be fine? Would we, take 6 months to learn Latin or whatever, or brush up on our Latin perhaps, and could we just slot right in?
Mm,
No idea, no
mm,
idea, right?
This
Because it's such a question.
this fits in
yeah.
perfectly with one of the questions that the audience asked. Somebody wanted to ask you, Greg, what is the one thing from history that we don't know enough about that you would like to learn about?
Oh, one thing I've got about 3,000
Good,
things I
go
want
for it. 3,000 things.
Um,
And
so many. There's so many.
while you're
I
thinking, to answer your question, I get a lot of
Yeah,
people who ask me, "What does Yule mean?" And I go, "We don't know." I would love to tell you what it's related to. I would love to tell you how we can understand it from other languages, but the word Yule and what Yulnir means, we don't know.
So
Anyway,
you don't say you'll be disappointed at the answer.
you will be disappointed. Yes. I
yeah,
had another student the other day who asked me, "What does the word Phoenician mean? Why are they called the Phoenicians?" And
yeah,
I said, "That's a great question. I can't answer that for you,
yeah,
and nobody
Mm,
can."
yeah. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? There are so many of those sort of. I mean, your question has stumped me because my brain is racing now. I'd love to spend a day with Leonardo da Vinci because he's my favorite person from history. I'd love to see how much of Shakespeare was improvised or workshopped. Like,
yeah.
I have no doubt Shakespeare existed. I have no doubt he was a genius. His plays are extraordinary. They're extraordinary pieces of poetry and drama, and the linguistic skill within them is extraordinary. But we know he had favorite actors. We know he had co-writers on some of his plays. Thomas Middleton and so on. I'd love to see what element of you know when you go see a comedian doing a working it out show and they're sort of workshopping stuff and they're trying jokes and it's not quite working, and then you see the show a year later and it's finished, a lot
Mm,
has changed. I'd love to see how much of Hamlet was in the first draft.
Hmm.
I'd love to know to what extent the audience laughing or crying sort of made him go, oh, well, we need to extend that scene because actually this is a good bit of. I'd love to know that sort of the performance sort of feedback loop of when you write a thing, a performer thing, and people react to it, and you go, interesting. I'll do more of that, less of this. Because again, with Homer, and was Homer real? Probably not, right?
Was
He's
he, what
probably
did he actually, was it the same Homer who wrote all the Homer things? We don't know.
sure. But as far as we can tell, he's probably not a guy. He may have been one guy, but there seems to be a kind of a variety of ancient
yeah.
rhapsodies who between them told numerous stories about the kind of Mycenaean Golden Age and the Trojan Wars, and chances are there are probably 50 or 60 different stories told about all the different characters in the same way the Marvel Universe has
Hmm.
overlapping multiple characters and they all get their own movie at some point. Apart from the women, you have to wait ages for the women to get their movie. But the blokes get their own movie early days. But is there an Ant-Man movie? Yes. Is there a well? There's an Odysseus movie. There's a sort of Achilles movie. Is
Hmm.
there a Hector movie? Are we
Mm,
missing a kind of Hector or Priam or Helen story? Like
mm.
the Homer, if he existed, write a Helen story? And is it 14,000 lines of extraordinary poetry? I mean, I'd love to know that. I'd love to know how
I'd love
these
to know if the
stories.
Trojan War really happened. I'd love to know
Well,
that.
that's the other thing, right? Schliemann found Troy, but there's like what 7 or 8 burned layers that could be any number of things could have brought them down, earthquakes and fires and
Hmm.
war.
Mm.
It would be really interesting to know. I'd love to get I suppose your question has made me ponder deeply, and I seem to be answering in terms of dramatic retellings. I seem to be interested in storytelling rather than
Yeah.
events,
Well,
which I'm
that's
sure.
that's kind of the thing that I observed is the fact that what you're describing is the stuff before it's stuff that's happening because people don't know that they're in a historical period, you know.
Mm,
And one of my friends once said uh, essentially every moment is modern in that sense. People don't they're not planning. Shakespeare
yeah,
wasn't planning for Henry, whichever play it was, or Othello to be the shape it was until it came to be. It wasn't something that he was thinking. Okay, in 500 years they're going to be studying this in high school. I better get this right. And that living nature is so rich. But the obvious one though is Roman dodecahedron.
Oh, yes, sorry.
What are they
Yes.
for?
It's not for knitting. That's what it's for.
Not for knitting.
I
Not
mean,
for
there are
knitting.
so many of those, aren't there? There are so many we don't know what this is for, so we think it's ritual. It's like we
Yeah.
always just go
Hmm.
probably
Hmm.
ritual. Yeah, I mean, of
Mm,
course, there are a million questions. I'd love to know the sheer logistics of how the Colosseum filled up and like the
mm.
crowd control element. I'd love to know because you go to a major football match on a Saturday and 64,000 people pile in, and that is some serious logistical challenges. Like you've got to get that many people into a building and it's got to be safe and they've got to get out safely again. How did the Romans do it? I'd be really interested to see. We know about the Roman gladiatorial thing, but I'm interested in like the public,
Mm.
theatrical going experience. What's it like to be a Roman? What can you hear? What can you see? How do the sort of snacks work? The sort of roast dormouse. Do you go to the sort of the little shop and buy and bring it back to your seat, or does someone go round and they offer them to you?
Someone
Little
squirt
things like that.
garum on it. Yeah,
Yeah,
fantastic. Yeah,
exactly. You bring your own garum sauce with you from
yeah,
home. Does everyone try? Like people go with hot sauce in their handbag.
yeah. Just
Do
leave it
you?
in the sun. It'll be even better.
Exactly.
Just leave.
Yeah.
Like-
Um, but also, I think I would love to just know how the Roman communication network worked. I'd be fascinated, and we know it worked. We know it's extraordinary the ability to get messages across this vast empire. But
Mm,
I'd be really interested to see what that actually meant on a proper day to day basis. When the emperor sends out an edict, and you have to wait 40 days or whatever for it to get across the vast empire, and then for the answer to come back. What do they do in the
mm.
meantime? Do they sort of sit there going, "Okay, we'll just wait it out until until the governor says yeah," or do you act on your, and this is why you get things like the year of the four emperors, the year of the five emperors, is
Mhm.
presumably because unilaterally you don't know what the other guy's doing. So you
Yeah.
declare yourself emperor. You go, I'm going to be emperor, and your local army are like, all right, you're emperor, and you march off, and then suddenly you find out, well, no, actually, this guy's declared emperor too. Hang on, there's a fourth guy. He's declared emperor as well. Right? Okay. Well, I guess we need to fight them. There must have been a huge amount of waiting for information gathering and of sort of sitting on your hands. And even in the 19th century, right, until the invention of the telegraph machine, it takes weeks, if not months, to get news from Australia.
But
You know, to
aren't a lot of these questions about the relationship between the past and the present almost questions about how we're sort of wanting to know how they would view us, aren't we? We're sort of
Mhm.
it's almost a case of like because one of my things I'm fascinated by is at what point do people have a solid sense that the future would be fundamentally different to today?
Yeah.
Were people in Roman times imagining that technology would change, that perhaps even the whole societal structure would essentially dissipate, if we don't want to say disappear? And one example from I've forgotten exactly when and who, but one example from medieval times was a monk who said something like, "Wouldn't it be funny if a cart didn't need a horse to pull it?" And it's interesting how, I mean, you mentioned the telegram, but
Yeah.
I think with post-industrialization, we've all become accustomed to the rate of change and the expectation that the future will be different, whether it's medicine or technology or as you say, communication. And I'm sort of, I think, sort of embedded in lots of these questions is often this sense of like, I guess, would they be impressed by what we've done?
Yeah.
Would Romans go, "Oh my God, the internet's amazing," or would they be like, "Actually, I prefer our technology." Um, you know,
Yeah.
but
It's a
you
really
get an instant answer. That's
You
ridiculous.
do, you do.
Like,
I mean, our expert for we did our episode on the history of the telephone, so the
Mhm.
150th anniversary episode. And our expert, Professor Johan Rees Morris, who's a historian of science and technology, he was sort of saying in the episode, the Victorians invent the idea of the future, that
mm,
they're the first civilization to actually start imagining and even romanticizing a possibility whereby new novel technologies will come along and transform, and that they're sort of imagining telephones and televisions, and they're imagining flying cars, and they're imagining trips to the moon, and that is true in many ways, in that they did it at large. But of course, we do know about early examples where people had pondered and wondered, like your monk.
mm,
We do, of course, have Roman writers looking at the possibility of flying to the moon,
Yeah,
as a sort of.
Leonardo da
mm,
Vinci thinking
You've
of
got
his
Leonardo da Vinci,
machines.
who's, yeah, and so it's a really interesting question. I'd love to do an episode on what did the future look like in the past. The history of the
yeah,
future is an amazing concept,
yeah,
but it's very hard to research because you kind of need to look everywhere to sort of figure out who's doing what. But certainly by the 19th century, we start to get this really clear thing, and it becomes a very known trope in newspapers. You start to see in
mm,
19th century newspapers these articles about what the future will look like. and it becomes more and more common. And now we see it all the time, and you'll
Mm.
quite often see kind of modern press releases about like in the future humans won't have hands, or whatever. We'll all just use telepathy to talk to our computers, and we'll evolve to have bigger buttocks because we sit down all day on computer, chairs, and we don't work anymore. And you kind of go, I don't know if that's true, but it's really interesting. What would I like to know about the past? I think I'm drawn to stories of people working together. I'm not a political historian, so I'm not particularly interested in great man theory. I don't tend to want to
Mm.
know what Julius Caesar thought when he crossed the Rubicon. I'm much more interested in the lives of ordinary people and what it was like on a day-to-day basis to be alive in the third century, or to experience something as terrifying as an invasion or a plague, or I don't want to. We've lived through our own plague. It's horrible, and we're living through a time of war now, which is horrible. So I don't want to
Mm.
experience that. But I suppose I'm interested what it was like to live amongst others and to be part of society in a world that's not like our own. That's what I'm
Mm.
drawn to most, I think. And the storytelling element, I think, comes off the back of that. I'm really interested in how do storytellers romanticize and mythologize, but also try to empathize with or understand the events of the past by sort of turning them into these narratives or these versions of the past that everyone can sort of agree on. And I'm sort of drawn to that. And I wrote a book on the history of celebrity culture as well,
Hmm.
which was also really exciting and interesting and challenging. It took me 4 years to write because it was such a big subject. And I was also really intrigued at that, to find that celebrity culture was already up and running in 1710.
Mm.
And that sort of threw me a bit. And it took me a long time to be confident in my findings before I was willing to sort of put my name on the front of the book and go, yeah, I believe this, because it felt so early. I'd love to know, am I wrong? I'd love to go back into the ancient Roman world and go, oh, no, this feels like celebrity here too. At the moment, I don't
Yeah.
think it is. At the moment, I think it's fame, which is linguistically similar, but not the same thing as
Not the
celebrity.
same.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have the commercial economy.
Mm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I would be fascinated to go back and see, is Diocles the charioteer, is he a celebrity? And I've got it wrong. Am I just looking at the wrong things, or is the lack of data has led me down the wrong avenue?
Mm.
There's so many things. I'm super aware of how wrong I am about most things, probably. And I spend most of
The best people are.
No, and if you're not, don't worry. Somebody on the internet will tell you.
yeah, yeah.
We're running out of time, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about your children's series.
Yeah,
And we obviously there you have many different children's books, and you have the You Are History from the Alarm Clock to the Toilet,
yeah.
which I gave to one of my students recently because he's always asking, "Where did the toilet come from? Where did the?" And I said, "You know what? There's a book on that." And I haven't heard the review from him yet, but I hope soon. But
Fingers crossed.
the Totally Chaotic History series. So first we have ancient Egypt,
Yeah.
and then Roman Britain, and then the Stone Age, and soon to be the Greek one, right?
Yeah, ancient Greece. Yeah, that's the
And
fourth in the series. Yeah.
tell us about that series and why it's so important.
They've been so fun to do. I co-write them with experts, which has been joyous. It's so nice to work with other people whose knowledge vastly eclipses my own, because it means that I get to shift role a little bit. I get to be funny and get to be a storyteller, and they get to ensure the information is true. So I can sort of change my responsibilities a bit to be a bit more silly and a bit more playful, which when you're doing things for kids is great because it means I get to be the clown. And because we're in constant dialogue, both in writing the book and actually in the book, I'm the storyteller in the book series, but the expert keeps marking my homework and correcting me and circling bits and going, "That's not true. No, not like this. No, that's wrong." Yeah. So the nice thing about it is that in some ways, it mirrors the historiographical process of peer review. So kids, when they read the book, although it's funny, although it's going at 100 miles an hour, it's a sort of, the book's called Totally Chaotic History. The idea is that we start at the beginning of the story and we get to the end and we just don't stop. And so things keep happening. And the joke is that I'm caught by surprise. I don't know what's coming next. And so I'm thrown. And so suddenly there's a war, so there's a revolution, suddenly the king's dead. And my expert co-writer does know, and they've got modern knowledge. So the nice thing about that is that I get to be the storyteller who is living at 100 miles an hour and freaking out every time something goes wrong. We've got a little machine called the chaos meter, which is like
Mhm.
a Geiger counter for chaos. And then my co-writer can go, "Yep, well, you won't believe what happens next because we're about to enter a Bronze Age or an Iron Age or or an intermediate period." Pardon me. And so the lovely, lovely thing about these books is that they get to be funny, which hopefully means that they're accessible to kids, aged about 8 up. But I'm also co-writing them with scholars, and so a lot of children's books are good at being accessible because it's a real skill, right, for kids. But often when you read them, the knowledge within them is sometimes a little bit out of date. These aren't necessarily scholars. They aren't necessarily people who are sort of keeping up with the new discoveries, new research, new theories. When you work with scholars, of course, you've got the brand new research, brand new discoveries, brand new theories. So it's really nice is to do a series of books that simultaneously, hopefully, entertains and provides a sort of madcap Animaniac style energy for 8-year-olds, where you're like racing through 2,000, 3,000 years of history at a go sometimes. The Egypt book was 4,500 years we covered. The Stone Age book was 3.5 million years in 150 pages. But at the same time, we stop every now and then, and the academic goes, right, you need to know about this, so let me just explain what this is. And in the Stone Age book, my academic was Dr. Brenna Hassett, who's a fantastic historian, archaeologist, and a specialist in. She's sort of a scientist, really. She's an archaeologist, but her PhD was in teeth, the science of teeth. So she explains things like, what is DNA? How do we study it? How do we, how are we knowing about these things? When were the Americas first populated? Well, we've just actually recently got new evidence to say at least 25,000 years ago. So it's really cool to do a book with a scientist, which was a change of gear for me, to have someone putting in scientific concepts into the book, explaining what is evolution, what drives evolution. It's not a power-up. You don't get to choose which bit of your body is going to lengthen or shorten. It happens through natural selection and random chaos. It's driven by climate change. That's the sort of primary driver in the Stone Age, is climate change forces animals to adapt or die. And so it's so fun to write a series that gets to be both silly and at the same time quite highbrow. You're doing the big ideas, but I get to do them with a stupid my gurning face, sort of being like, hey. So it's been really, really lovely. And yeah, the fourth book is with Professor Michael Scott, who's Professor Ancient History. So book one was with Dr. Campbell Price, who's a museum curator, fantastic Egyptologist. Book two, Roman Britain, with Dr. Emma Southern. Book three, The Stone Age, with Dr. Brenna Hassett. And then book four, Professor Michael Scott. And you can hear Michael on You're Dead to Me a few times. Emma was our expert on Boudica for You're Dead to Me. Campbell has been on You're Dead to Me a few times. We haven't got Brenna on yet. We need to get Brenna on. So the joy of it is, again, as with Horrible Histories, don't dumb down to kids. Dumb up.
Yeah.
It's all the same information, but with neon paint all over it. Just scatter the jokes, the chaos, the energy. And I'm really proud of the books. They're hard to do because they're a really challenging format, but they're so fun, and it's been an absolute joy. So I'm really proud of them, and yeah, I'd love to do more in the future. I'm probably not going to do more anytime soon because I'm going back to writing for adults in my next project.
Ew, gross.
But yeah,
What book are you writing for adults next?
I cannot tell you. It is
Oh,
a
the
top
worst.
secret.
So the worst.
Top secret. I haven't technically signed the deal yet, so it's still, it's hopefully going through this week.
It will come. It will come.
But it will be funny, as all my books. There'll be a sense of humor to it, and there'll be a narrative to this one. It won't be a thematic history. I can tell you that. So, Dead Famous was a history of celebrity. It was thematically structured. A Million Years in a Day is thematically structured. Ask a Historian was just 50 short essays. This will be my first narrative for adults.
And so for Ask a Historian, it still is one of your bestsellers. How did you choose those questions?
We got about 650 questions, if I remember rightly. So it was quite hard. About 50 of them were about Anne Boleyn, so that was quite easy. Just immediately get rid of the Anne Boleyn questions. Just choose one. People love Anne Boleyn; they're obsessed with her. Because we on the podcast we have a no Nazis, no Tudors policy on You're Dead to Me because people are so obsessed with World War II and the Tudors, so we don't do that. But then it became a question of trying to organise them into a theme. I wanted to make sure that there were sort of organising themes, so I started to sort of try to bunch the questions. So if there were sort of 5 on food history, 5 on pop culture and history, if there were 5 on technology, 5 on language and linguistics, 5 on global history, Africa, China, India, 5 on kind of military history. I think someone asked me how did knights go to the toilet in suits of armor. Like it's a classic. It's a question I wanted to know when I was 10, and it was a joy to answer
Can
that.
opener.
Yeah. Yes, having just watched the Night of the Seven Kingdoms, the Game of Thrones spin-off, there's a fair amount of suits of armor questions in that, and I was like, oh yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, trying to find an organizing principle, because when you get that many questions in, obviously you can sort of just go, oh, there's too many to answer. In order to write a good book, I think there needs to be a raison d'etre for them. So I chose the ones I could answer straight away, because that's nice, and I chose the ones that are the hardest to answer because I thought that would be a challenge. And the ones that were sort of fairly easy to answer, I sort of sometimes went, I don't need to do that one because someone can probably Google that. So I found myself choosing the things that I care about most because they're my passion projects, and the things that I'm very daunted by because I thought it'd be exciting to push myself. And I often found myself having to ask a historian so I could write my book, Ask a Historian. So I often was getting expert advice from other scholars on, so someone asked, how accurate was the Flintstones in representing the Stone Age? And I was like, that's a good question. So I spoke to Dr. Rebecca Ragg-Sykes, who's a brilliant Neanderthals expert,
Yeah.
and wrote a fantastic book called Kindred, and she was our Neanderthals expert on You're Dead to Me. I sort of wrote to her, and she and I watched an episode of Flintstones on YouTube, and we sort of went through it, and it was fascinating. She kept stopping and going, that's true, and that's accurate. Yeah, they wouldn't do that. No, they didn't drive cars. They didn't have dinosaur pets, but there were these really interesting things that kept popping up that she was able to go, well, obviously that's a joke, and it was really exciting to sort of see the wheels turning in her brain, because this was someone who just knows it inside out, who was able to sort of look at a very silly 1960s sitcom cartoon about a family with pet dinosaurs, but actually to go, no, that's kind of accurate. And it was really, that was fun to witness that.
I love that book. I love the question of what was the first Monday. And the correct answer is
Yes,
that Mondays were invented by Big Work to sell more weekend. That's
that's it. Who invented the first Monday? That stumped me for ages.
that's a great one.
I was reeling for ages to like, how do I answer this? Because it's like such a difficult question. But I started to sort of realize that actually the history of the days of the week is really interesting. The history of
Yeah.
the working week is interesting. The history of the weekend is a fascinating 19th century invention.
Hmm.
As you say, it's all to do with,
What is a weekend? Yes.
yeah, yeah. What is the weekend? But yeah, what was the first Monday? Really, really good question. And it's the kind of thing you go, I'll get back to you on that. give me a month. I loved answering that one. I really liked answering the one about who was the richest person in history, because that's a challenging one, because currency rates fluctuate. Inflation is obviously very difficult to calculate, and also it's really hard to know what level of personal income a Roman emperor would have as opposed to state income. So Augustus Caesar, unbelievably wealthy. Did he access that money himself directly as
Unbelievably
emperor?
indebted. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to what extent is it the Roman state that has that we wouldn't say, you wouldn't say Keir Starmer is the richest man in Britain, but I suppose in theory he could deploy $1 trillion, or £1 trillion worth of debt if he wanted to tomorrow. Maybe not tomorrow. I mean, but it's an intriguing question. So I enjoyed that one. That was challenging.
Was it
And
Mansa Musa?
Mansa Musa was one of my answers. Mansa
Oh,
Musa
okay.
is,
Okay.
because Mansa Musa is famously the Malian sultan who kind of arrived into Egypt and gave so much gold that he crashed the economy,
Yeah.
because he was so generous that all money lost value because suddenly everyone had like just gold, and so you'd go to the shops and be like, I have gold, and the shopkeeper would be like, I have gold. Everyone has gold, and so suddenly it's like, oh, we've all got gold, so actually nothing's worth anything anymore. That's quite funny. So yes, Mansa Musa was one of them. Obviously the Vanderbilts, Rockefellers are up there. And there was another one. My agent, I later discovered it was my agent who asked this. This was so hard, but there are 54 countries in Africa. How did they get their boundaries? Was his question. And that's so difficult. I had to go at answering myself, and turned out I got it really wrong. It was really interesting. I thought I knew quite a lot about the kind of Berlin Conference and the kind of the partition of Africa in the 19th century between the kind of big empires and whatever. And it turns out the scholarship had moved on a lot in those sort of 15, 20 years since I'd been a student. And so I ended up contacting a really brilliant expert who very kindly took the time to, give me a reading list, talk through with it with me, and went through my draft and sort of just pointed out all the places I'd sort of gone wrong. That was a really fantastic case study of, as I say, I'm acutely aware of how much I don't know. And in that particular instance, I thought maybe I could answer it. And when I actually showed it to an expert, they went, "Oh, no, 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 no. We have changed our mind on this enormously in the past 20 years. Here's where we are now." And that was really exciting, but also a sort of quite an important lesson for me, that I need to make sure that when I've got this real privilege, I have this platform that I sort of have ended up with, which I'm incredibly lucky to have, but also I need to make sure that I use my platform properly. Like, I can't just be out there doing willful misinformation just because I'm like, yeah, I know this, and turns out I don't. So for me, the public historian bit means that I've got to make sure I'm still in dialogue with academic experts and scholars and people doing field work and archaeologists. And it's really, really crucial. And that's why You're Dead to Me and my children's books are collaborations with experts, because I don't have that knowledge, and I wouldn't be able to. No one can keep up with everything. You can't be across all of modern scholarship. It's impossible, right? You can have your field, but I'm everywhere. I do Stone Age to Phone Age. So I have to make sure I am working in concert with people who know what they're talking about. And then I hopefully can make it a bit more accessible, or put some jokes in there. So yeah, it's
As my
challenging.
friend Dr. Kat Day, who's a chemist, she said to me, you will make sure that they have good information. And that's true. It's very interesting. When I started doing my linguistics programs and historical linguistics and history bits, that is something that I panic about as well, because I want to make sure that I have good information rather than just, what I learned at school. And then, you have again, like the keyboard people going, that's not right because Miss Simpson in the second grade told me this. Going, well, again, as you
Yeah,
say, we've moved on from that, and
yeah.
people are still learning things that are 50, 60 years old that are
It's
just not correct.
but isn't it amazing how attached people are to information they learned at school? They're
Mm,
really emotionally attached to it. Like,
mm,
they get angry when you say, "Ah, we don't think that's true anymore." They get
mm.
upset. It's
It's
almost like
almost sort of foundational for them in that sense. Yeah,
right. I
yeah.
agree. I think it's
Mm,
almost like it destabilizes their sense of self somehow,
mm.
as if you're attacking their
Well, it's
very
because
Well,
they had to
existence.
know it for the test, and if they got it right on the test,
I
why
know,
is
but
it wrong
that's
well,
now?
but also having it in your pocket means you don't have to relearn it as well. It's something that you can
yeah.
hold on to. And I mean, something that you guys talking has reminded me of. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking about Beachy Head Lady with someone who'd done research on how the story of Beachy Head Lady in the public sphere came to be, and the fact that
Mm,
it's actually quite messy. And in that conversation, I sort of posited the fact that we really need to encourage perhaps a new bit of punctuation, which is a confident question mark. It's not just like a, oh no. It's more a case of no. We know we don't know this,
yeah.
and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
I love that.
Um,
I love
mm,
that.
but I'm not
Yeah.
really sure
I
what it would look like.
Everyone mocked Donald Rumsfeld. I'm no fan of Donald Rumsfeld. Let me just be
Yeah.
caveat up front here. Not my favorite person. But when he made that very famous speech, there are things that we know, there are things we know we don't know, and there are things we don't know we don't know.
Yeah.
And everyone mocked him for it. And I think it's one of the most important and useful phrases there is for
Mm,
what it is we do. There are things we know, there are things we are aware of that we're lacking, where we go, if only we had this, but it's gone. Unfortunately, we know that this play was written by, Euripides, but it's gone. And then there are things that we don't know, right? There are things we have not even thought about that we should perhaps one day stumble on. It's such a useful indication. And
mm,
so after that, I started using various things. I used the first phrase fact, which means something that's currently existing as knowledge. Fict, which is something that people think is true but is wrong. Factatum, which is fact at the moment. So it's a fact that is probably
oh.
going to be disproved, but it's a fact at the moment. So factatum. And fucked, which is something which is true, which is bad news. So we are. So if you discover a fucked, that is a fuct. That is that's a fact that maybe ruins your entire PhD
But that's why you
thesis.
need a factotum to put them all
Yeah,
together.
exactly. So fict, factatum, fact, and fucked would be my architecture for understanding. But just to go back very briefly to what we were just talking about before with the school curriculum, I would love it if children were taught that one of the great things about knowledge is that we're always changing our knowledge, and that's something
Yes.
that should be welcomed, and that's part of what the education process should impart. We're familiar with in the scientific process in terms of the scientific model of like, you test a theory, you trying to destroy the theory until eventually you're like, okay, we think this is true. But in history and in humanities and in scholarship and whatever, we're much less good at explaining that actually it's vital and important and healthy to keep challenging, overturning, keep questioning, and that this is something we should build into our way of thinking and being, and that something you learn when you're 8 from Mrs. Smith, the fact that it may no longer be true when you're 48 is not that's not a travesty. That in some ways that's probably a good thing, that it may not hold true. So I'd love for that to be folded into the curriculum somewhere to make sure that kids grow up falling in love with the notion that knowledge changes and asking questions is good, and that we should welcome doubt.
Is there anything else that you would like people besides the You're Dead to Me tour, which is happening right now, and
It is happening right now,
the next show is April 9th, I believe.
In Cardiff, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So get tickets if you're anywhere near there. I'm sorry, I'm not anywhere near there. Please do You're Dead to Me world tour so I can actually show up to these things. And
yes.
and is
In
there
Cardiff,
anything?
Edinburgh, and Manchester. So you're not near any of those, are you, Michelle? That's a shame. Okay,
No.
sorry.
In my heart.
Thank you. Yes.
The Commonwealth
That's
tells me I'm close, but not actually.
yeah. The only other thing to mention, I suppose, just over Christmas time, we did a children's podcast on the BBC called Kids on the BBC. It was really good fun. It was called Dead Funny History,
Yes.
and it was based on an existing series we made during the pandemic called Homeschool History.
Yes.
So Dead Funny History was a deliberate attempt to retool Your Dead to Me episodes for children. So we took the scholars from those episodes, we took the research that they gave us, we rewrote it as funny little 15-minute radio kind of comedy skits with me narrating, where the person from history that we were talking about would sometimes argue with me. So I'd be arguing with Ramesses the Great and so on.
Yeah.
And so
No, I
that's sort of
didn't.
little, yeah, exactly. And so I'd say he wasn't that great, and Ramesses would be like, "What?
Yes,
How
I
dare
was.
you?"
Yes.
So that was a fun little thing. And so if you've got kids of that age, they may like my books, the totally chaotic books. They might like them in audiobook and whatever. But if they want short, sharp, funny little podcasts that are based on research by scholars with PhDs, but with me doing stupid voices and very funny actors doing funny voices and funny jokes, that's on the BBC. It didn't get its own BBC channel, so it's in the You're Dead to Me feed, weirdly. So it's called Dead Funny History, but you have to go to You're Dead to Me to find it, which is a little bit odd. And Homeschool History does have its own channel. So those are available if people have young kids.
Anything else you want to point people to that you would, but besides this is my favorite book that you've done, which is A Million Years
Is
in a
it?
Day.
That's nice.
As you can see, I have annotated. And so this one, if you're not sure what to get, I highly recommend this one because even though I do love the Ask a Historian one, and some of the questions are really profound and incredible,
Yeah.
and but this one I love because of the way that it's structured. It's every maybe 5 or 10 minutes, kind of a day, but it's how things would have been done throughout history in the morning, and then well, what does that mean to be have a morning? What does it mean to what do you do at 9? Is it law? Is it complot? What's going on here? And all through history, the time is set up in very specific ways, which I think is very interesting. And as the kids say, oh, it's highly readable. So I think for people who are like, oh, I don't want an academic book, but you really want to as you say, from the Stone Age to the Phone Age. If you really want to learn about things in a very eclectic kind of way, I highly recommend A Million Years in a
Yeah,
Day.
it's my first book. I wrote it a long time ago. We're actually going to hopefully reissue it next year. I'm going to do an update on it, hopefully, and give it a new introduction and add some new case studies in and change the cover. I think because the idea is to sort of bring it up to date. Because as we say, over the 13 years or so that I started writing it, I think new things have been discovered. I might hopefully be putting that back out there. But yes, A Million Years in a Day is about the history of daily life, and it's about trying to be accessible for everyone. Dead Funny History is real fun to do. Dead Famous is the book that I'm proudest of because it took 4 years and it was an absolute nightmare to research. So that's my history of celebrity culture, and that's actually my most successful book now. But it wasn't for a while. It took a while to find its readers, but it's now my most successful book. But that's the one I'm sort of proudest of. But I think it's a little bit more highbrow. It's a little bit more academic. A Million Years in a Day is basically toilets and lunch and breakfast and pets and
You
the
say that,
history
but
of.
you do go into some very interesting things that
Yeah,
maybe
I try.
people
I try
wouldn't have
to.
thought of.
I try to, but it is the history of stuff you use all the time. And that's it then inspired my children's book, You Are History, which is
Hmm.
exactly the same. It's 50 things a child uses every day. So those, yeah, that's, yes, I think I've got 8 books, 7, 8, 9, but I don't know. I have some books. I don't know. I've lost count of how many books I've got. Some are for adults, some are for kids, and same for podcasts. So if anyone's interested in that sort of thing. And also, if anyone's an Audible customer, I
Hmm.
did a super niche podcast during the pandemic for them, an 8-part series called The Somewhat Complete History of Sitting Down, which is a mega nerdy series on the history of seating as a cultural phenomenon.
Mm,
So, like chairs, but also
mm,
why do we sit? How do we sit? How does
mhm.
our gender and class and age affect who gets to sit on what and when? It was super interesting. All we did is we went round and we interviewed academics. We had no research. We had no like the pitch document was like a 1-page document. Just went, Greg will ask about seating, and that was it. And then we went around and we went to brilliant experts, brilliant professors, and we just said to them, "Tell me about the history of seating." And they would be like, "What do you mean? What do you mean? That's not a podcast." And they were like, "No, but
Mhm.
just tell me the first thing that comes to mind." It was amazing. Every single person we interviewed was still talking an hour and a half later, and they all just went, "How is this so interesting?" None of them understood why it would work, and by the end of it, all of them were like, "This is an amazing subject," and it is. It's a subject that we all take for granted, but we're all sitting down right now. We're all sitting on certain chairs for a certain reason, but
Hmm.
who gets to sit and when? How do you sit in protest? How do you sit in power on a throne, on the floor? In Japan, you sit differently to in Mexico, you sit differently again in England. What about if you're a baby or a child? Or what if you're on a coach or a plane? Or like the politics of sitting? How do you sit in parliament? How do you sit in power or in opposition to power? It's amazing how interesting it was. I loved making that series. Of course, there's an episode about sitting on the toilet. Of course, there is.
Of course there
Um,
is.
but that's called A Somewhat Complete History of Sitting Down, and it's a sort of niche little thing. I'm really proud of it because I learned so much, and it was a really interesting lesson in you can turn your attention to the most random thing, take it seriously, and you can find yourself spending 8 hours talking about it. And if you do that for everything in your life, everything's got a story, and that was really lovely because it told me to have confidence in my belief that social history is the best because it's the stuff that we all use and we care about.